Welcome to Channel 24. The latest round of talks in Abu Dhabi has wrapped up, with a new round expected next week. President Zelensky says US security guarantees for Ukraine are ready to be signed, while Europe is being pushed to lock in its commitments. So the question is whether this process can deliver real security or just more leverage. John Sweet, retired US Army colonel, and Mark Toth, foreign affairs and security policy expert in the weekly program with John Sweet and Mark Toth, are joining me now. So we have a lot to unpack today, and welcome to both of you.
Hey, thanks for having us on the show, Natalie.
Great to be here, Natalie. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. So how, first of all, how would you assess the talks in the UAE, and President Zelensky has said that Ukraine will not give up the Donbas under any peace deal and that a compromise must be found. What kind of a compromise is actually possible if Ukraine's red line is territorial integrity?
Well, let me start with that, and then I'll hand it over to Mark. First of all, it's 0 for 7 is the record right now that the United States and Ukraine have with negotiating with Putin. So it's not really much forward momentum. Okay, in pushing the next meeting to 1 February, it only provides another week of aerial bombardments and meat type of assaults, what they call, on the front lines, which is going to result in another 10,000 plus Russian soldiers being killed, and probably upwards to another 100 to 200 Ukrainian civilians being killed or wounded in their homes as a result of ballistic missiles and drones falling upon them. So I don't see any forward momentum, especially as you just noted. The two sticking points right now are getting Russia to stop attacking Ukrainian energy, but the most important, really, as far as the negotiations are concerned, is the status of the Donbass. And Zelensky's already said he's not going to give it up no matter what pressure Russia puts upon him or the United States. So we're at a sticking point, and I think the leverage is going to have to start being pushed against Russia to come off of their Donbass sticking point and not against Ukraine. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, right. Mark, what is your take?
Yeah, no, I think if you step back, there are all kinds of negotiations going on here. One, you've got what's happening in the United Arab Emirates, and I think that's a bit of a kabuki theater. That's each side trying to get something out of it. For Putin, he's simply trying to buy time. That's what we're looking at here, to continue his war against Ukraine, which is one way of doing that. For Ukraine itself, however, though, I think it's more productive in that it's done two things. It's pretty much, as we understand it, locked in U.S. security guarantees. Whether or not Ukraine can rely on those in the future, time will tell, but they've locked that in. The other thing that Ukraine has been able to lock in as a result of these negotiations is its own integration into the European Union, et cetera, down the road. So those are two valuable things for Ukraine to have achieved, for Zelensky's negotiating team to have brought about. But in terms of these negotiations, I think the other set that we keep sometimes failing to focus on and talk about are the negotiations that Putin is doing by kinetic attacks on cities like Kiev, Lviv, others, Kharkiv, et cetera, that are coming at the end of ballistic missiles, drones, et cetera, and even hypersonic missiles from time to time. That tells us that Putin is nowhere close to settling on a peace agreement. And it also tells us that there's no way that Ukraine should be even coming close to ceding or the strategic belt lines, defensive belt lines around the Donbas that protects Kiev, Sumy, Kharkiv, and ultimately Odessa as well. So as good as it is to be talking, things can be happening. I don't think that it's going to lead to a peace treaty anytime soon.
Yeah, right. But I see the huge advantage right now for Russia. As you said, it's buying time, definitely. But I don't see any objectivity for Ukraine to continue these meetings.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, well, let me step back. Let me play devil's advocate for a little bit. One of the things, and I think Zelensky learned this lesson after the disaster last January in the White House, is that you need to stay on the good side of Trump. That doesn't mean you need to bow down to him. That doesn't mean you need to make concessions to him. But if this is the process that Trump wants to play out, go ahead and play that game with him. Walk down that path as far as that you can and get what you can get out of it. In this case, what Ukraine's getting out of it is some some goodwill. Ukraine's also not getting intel turned off like happened or in February in the critical months that saw the loss of Kursk, et cetera. And looking like you're not the party that's an obstacle to peace. I think those are all positives. It's also resulted in, as Zelensky himself has said, the security guarantees that he views at least sufficient to move forward. And like I just mentioned, the integration in the European Union. That's all good. So I think for Ukraine to continue these, it makes sense. But I think for the Ukrainian people, they have to understand that peace really isn't what Zelensky's after here in the long run, because Russia isn't. I mean, don't get me wrong. I know Zelensky in Ukraine wants to achieve a peace deal, but it's just not possible under these circumstances. So you're right to be skeptical. But I think in this case, to answer your original point, it's simply Zelensky being clever, saying, okay, I know I've got to do this. I don't, like a doctor, I don't want to do any harm to the patient. So I'm going to go through this and let Putin harm his own position, which is happening. Every day that he attacks Ukraine is proof enough that he's not interested in peace.
But also, I was reading that today in the morning that there is a growing sense that these talks are putting the victim and the aggressor on the same level, and they are not the same. So,
that's certainly what Putin wants you to believe, right? That's exactly what he wants you to believe. I'm being attacked unfairly. Ukraine's attacking me. Ukraine's terrorists. Ukraine's this. Ukraine's that. But let's remember, when we get back to the point of the matter, the root cause of this conflict starts with Putin. Everything that's occurring today is a result of Putin. And you cannot look at Ukraine and tell them that they cannot defend themselves against Putin. And by defending themselves, they're going after Russian targets that sustain their ability to continue fighting, one, but also their ability to launch ballistic missiles and drones against them. So, and the other thing they're doing, obviously, is they're killing upwards to 1,300 or 1,200 Russian soldiers a day. So this isn't about Russia, but they want you to believe it's about Russia because that's the narrative that they're pushing.
Yeah, Natalie, I would add to that when you consider in a normal sense, you're correct, that it would be creating a status between the two that are equal under normal circumstances. But these are not normal circumstances. You have a U.S. president that is in a rush to get to a peace deal that is very transactional in nature. And he is the one, in effect, that is equating, in one sense, Ukraine and Russia as partners at this table. But in many ways, early on in Trump's administration, he was somehow blaming the victim here. So it's even worse than what she said. It's not just equalizing these two opponents on the battlefield. It was a reversal in roles here, as though somehow Ukraine caused this war, Zelensky caused this war, Biden caused this war, Europe caused this war, everyone else caused this war except the man who actually invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, which is crazy. So, again, I get the argument, and it's a valid one, but I think Zelensky has no choice here in order to preserve Ukraine's position at the negotiating table to be at it, even though, as you point out, it somewhat equalizes the status between him and Putin, because without Zelensky there, I think it only gets worse, and I think Ukraine only gets blamed, and I think Trump only becomes more petulant. So kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type situation.
I'm just still worrying whether the United States is picking the right negotiation framework at all.
Yeah, we struggle with that also. We think the negotiation framework ought to be applying more leverage against Russia, and it should be, because quite frankly, again, Russia is the aggressor, and you have to get Russia to stop. Look, sanctions haven't worked. Appeasing Russia, trying to give them things to get them to the negotiation table hasn't worked. The only thing that works with Russia, and we've said this many times, it's a punch in the face, a bloody nose. And that right now, the leverage that the United States has right now for that is probably the one remaining weapon system, that's the Tomahawk missile. And of course, Germany has a weapon system that Russia doesn't want to face, also, the Taurus missile. So deep strike capabilities against Russia's ability to continue their attacks is what Ukraine needs, in addition to the ability to protect themselves against those ballistic missile and drone strikes. Now, we've just seen within the past week that the United States has agreed to provide more Patriot missiles, and Norway stepped up to the plate to provide more NASA missiles. But defeating the missile in the air versus destroying the missile launcher on the ground are two different stories. And I think we need to focus on that missile launcher more than the individual missile in the sky.
At the same time, in Davos, President Zelensky urged Europe to move from a coalition of the willing to the coalition of action. What concrete steps can the European Union realistically, from your point of view, take this winter to protect Ukraine's energy system and civilians?
Yeah, Nataliia, it's a great question. Look, since last December, when President Trump was elected, John and I both argued, look, this is a World War III. It's not Hollywood's version. It's basically death by 1,000 cuts. It's a different kind of war, and that Trump held all of the cards. If he simply got more behind Ukraine in terms of weapon systems, Tomahawks, et cetera, free flowing of ammunition, et cetera, so there weren't shortages of 155 artillery shells, et cetera, right? All of that was there. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But in terms of where we're headed right now, what Europe can do to stop these attacks, they do have to stop talking. Look, every time that we look up, there's another meeting, to have a meeting, to schedule a meeting, to talk about what the coalition of the willing can do in a post-war environment. Well, if people haven't noticed, there's a war going on every single day in Ukraine. They don't have time for that. And the thing that they could do immediately that would have an immediate impact and not only help Ukraine, but protect the eastern flank of NATO states like Poland, the Baltic states, et cetera, that have already had drone and Russian fighter jet incursions into their airspace, would be to implement what John and I have long called for several years now, a no-fly zone in Western Ukraine. Get that done. Start protecting that energy infrastructure. Interdict these missiles that are coming in to the best that they can, similar to what the U.S. and its allies have done in the Mideast to protect Israel when they've been under attack from Iran. Those are the things that have to be done and need to be done. Europe's not stepping that up right now. So to circle back to your previous question, right now, the peace talks are the only framework because Europe is not giving more options as well. Oftentimes, countries keep looking to Trump to say, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? We agree. He could do more. He should be doing more. It would be great if he did more, but he's not. But that doesn't excuse Europe not acting. And I think we saw that in Davos. Zelensky came out very strongly criticizing Europe for its lack of response. Europe needs to wake up because this war is now. This war is kinetic. It's hot, and it's only going to grow over time. It's already hybrid throughout Europe in terms of Russian sabotage, espionage, influence peddling, election interference, et cetera. It's only going to get worse down the road. Europe has to understand this war is their war right now in Ukraine. Merz gets it, but it's not enough just to say it. He's got to start acting on it. Do a frickin' no-fly zone.
Now, let me just add one point. It's we're beyond, at least from Europe's perspective, we're beyond this. We don't want to confront Russia. We don't want a direct confrontation with Russia. We don't want. Look, Russia doesn't care. Russia has been directly confronting Europe for the past 3 years. I mean, call it hybrid warfare, but nonetheless, they're crossing international boundaries with their aircraft. Drones and missiles are blowing up in territories of NATO. Unexplained fires are taking place at warehouses where 155 rounds are being produced. People are being assassinated. Electrical grids are being taken down. Airspace is being shut down because of drones over airports throughout Europe. Russia is in a hybrid war, yes, but sooner or later, Europe has to step up and understand the only confrontation is going to be have any results is a direct confrontation. And we're not saying invade Russia, but we are saying get aircraft up in the air and stop the penetration of airspace, both in Europe and Ukraine.
But at the same time, the United States is shifting forces toward the Middle East while reducing its presence, definitely in the Indo-Pacific. So how dangerous is it for Ukraine if Washington's attention and resources move away from Europe?
Yeah, no, I'll let John get to that in a quick second. But yeah, sorry there. One of the things that I think that it tells Ukraine at the negotiating table is, look, if the U.S. is wanting to pivot away from Europe, then you have to take that into your calculus about security guarantees. If the U.S. is lessening its footprint in Europe, and not just in terms of actual boots on the ground, but training exercises, et cetera, all that's important to be able to be a proactive, active force when needed. From a defensive standpoint, that should be of concern. It should be a concern to Europe as well. So that's one aspect of that. The other aspect of that, though, is that any type of settlement that gets done, if it does, and I'm very doubtful that it will, in the UAE between Russia and Ukraine, has to take into account that Europe may have to take the lead in the future in defending if those security guarantees get triggered, and whether or not they've got enough right-sized forces. So the U.S. position is going to be what it's going to be. John and I often talk about when we write about actions and reactions, and certainly at this point is evidenced just by the lack of ability to strike in Ukraine when it to strike in Iran when it was timely at the height of those protests. The U.S. military at this point is stretched. It's stretched in the Caribbean with respect to the ongoing interdictions of oil tankers, et cetera, and the potential for a second strike if it's needed in Venezuela. It's stretched moving assets from the Indo-Pacific into the Persian Gulf, operating near the Gulf of Oman, to be able to potentially strike Iran. And yes, that does create exposure for the U.S. now in the Indo-Pacific. And who knows, Chinese President Xi Jinping could decide to act on that. So I think if I'm Europe, and especially if I'm Ukraine, we've got to be wary there are limits to U.S. power at any given point in time. And I'm speaking conventionally. John, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of actual boots on the ground?
Yeah. Let me just add, and we've written about this a lot, and what we talk about is national security strategy, and national defense strategy, by the way. The United States military right now just isn't built to take on 3 and 4 contingencies, major contingencies at one time. Okay, so the Middle East is a significant contingency. Ukraine is a significant contingency. Venezuela became a significant draw of manpower, so it became a drain of military capability. North Korea is a contingency, and then also Taiwan is a contingency. So it's hard to be at 4 or 5 places at once, which brings us back to the word alliance, which is why you're part of alliances, and you don't have to be strung out. You can be part of something bigger in which you can bring powers together and you can utilize each other's niches to form a credible fighting force. And I think that's what we are forgetting, we as the United States, is that NATO is a credible fighting force as an alliance, and we don't have to be significantly invested in Europe, but we do need to participate both military, and we have 85,000 soldiers in Europe right now, and we have American leadership there in the forms of the SOC-EUR there at SHAPE headquarters in Mons, Belgium. So not built to fight 4 different wars at one time, but are in a position through alliances to do so.
And you know what I've found? That Ukraine Foreign Intelligence, it's not like hidden information, services now describes Belarus and China as a key enablers of Russia's war effort, from components and machinery to sanctions, evasion, and industrial support. What does this level of backing change on the battlefield and in the overall trajectory of the Russia's war?
Yeah, let me set that up.
I'll let Mark do China, okay? Hey, Mark, let me do Belarus first, and you can knock out the China piece. Belarus from the beginning has supported Russia in this war. They allowed Russia to launch their invasion from their territory. Both the helicopters attack that went into Kyiv or tried to take Kyiv and surrounding airports, but they also enabled Russia to launch ballistic missiles from their territory. Belarus has provided Russia with weapons, tanks, BMPs, ammunition. They allow the Russians to train in Belarus. Okay, in exchange for what? In exchange for nuclear missiles, because Belarus is scared to death that Poland's going to do something. So they want nuclear missiles stored there in Minsk. But also we've seen the introduction of hypersonic missiles in Belarus. And just most recently, we've seen Belarus going on a full alert. That full alert is just a military demonstration to try to get Poland to back down, to not threaten them, okay? But they are a significant enabler to Russia, and Russia, quite frankly, needs that. We've written about this, and we called it the arsenals of evil, and in that case, we identified it as Iran, North Korea, and China, but certainly add Belarus to that mix. Mark, China.
Yeah, no, Natalie, look, since I believe it was December of 2022, John and I have been arguing that China, Belarus, these arsenal of evil countries, North Korea, Iran, have been in a global ideological war with the U.S. that's increasingly turned kinetic. We were on Fox News back then saying that, and we'd written a piece for the Daily Mail in London articulating that very position. There's nothing new here. What people are picking up on now, that there's some kind of cohesive effort here, is something that has been clearly out there. That footprint has been there. What has changed with respect to China initially is China's idea of engaging Europe was different. It had hoped to do so through its Belt and Road Initiative that was supposed to run through Ukraine, key railroad nodes, et cetera, that were supposed to establish significantly more trade throughout the European Union, some of it heading through Poland as well. That didn't happen. And then over time, when China realized that its position was starting to be lost in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative in Ukraine, it realized, look, there are advantages to be had if it starts to support the Russian war effort through partnering with them. And then obviously Belarus. I think Belarus is more like a Mussolini figure, though, or a country like Italy was during World War II. I think they're going to do what they're going to do is the pressure is applied to them from Moscow. But China, I think, is the interesting factor here because they have shifted. I think originally they wanted this war to get over quickly. They wanted to get back to the Belt and Road Initiative as an approach to dominating trade with the EU. That didn't happen. Now they're recognizing that they have other opportunities that if they can help Russia continue this war, and not necessarily to win at this point, but to continue to weaken Russia, that increases Chinese interests in the far east of Russia. And we're seeing that. We're seeing laws change. We're seeing companies start to buy up Russian companies in Siberia, et cetera, and that China's been able to kind of gobble up parts of Russia, not through military means, but through economic means. So, this is a very twisted spider web that has, many angles to it. But definitely, I think it's good that the world wakes up and realizes it's all interconnected. This is not just simply a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and China that's against the West. And, it's about time that we start waking up to that. I still don't think we have. I don't think people get the global nature of this war. But it is very, very much global in design and in construct and in implementation.
Yes, John and Mark, I absolutely agree. Of course, Beijing and Minsk are nothing new in Russia's war. I didn't know about the scale of the help. Of course, they are helping Russia to feed their war economy and bypass sanctions. I just didn't know that is so huge, and I could not realize how sustainable is this cooperation could be. And I mean, is there any political, economic, or strategic limits that could force China or Belarus to step back of helping Russia?
No, I don't think so. I think they're all in. They've committed. Look, Lutsenko understands that if the Putin regime collapses, his regime collapses. So he's all in. China, not as much, but China also sees opportunities beyond Russia. Okay, China has aspirations and eyes on former territories that they deemed that used to be China at one time, and Siberia falls into that category. So China's okay with the weakening of Russia as well. So it's interesting how it all plays out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just quickly, Natalie, I would add, I think China's angle now has to be one of, do they really want peace in Ukraine? Because initially that's what they wanted. They like I said, they wanted to get on to the Belt and Road Initiative. But now, however, especially if they want to move on Taiwan, it's useful to Beijing to have the U.S. stretched a bit, as well as Europe stretched a bit, by having to supply the Ukrainian military to continue to fight Putin. So from that standpoint, it makes more sense for this war for them to keep going than it does necessarily to end. That's what happens when you have an axis of evil allies that suddenly find themselves capable of turning on each other or abandoning them at a moment's notice. Look at how quickly Iran was abandoned by Russia. Look how quickly Venezuela lost those Russian protections as well. It's all good when it's going your way, but when a den of thieves, and that's what I would describe Russia, Belarus, China, North Korea, and Iran, start having their own self-interest at stake, they start stabbing each other in the back. So it's very interesting. Keep an eye on China.
Right. So I think I have a few questions left. President Zelensky, he said that Ukraine can become a global tech hub for security, for cyber, space, and defense innovation. But is this vision really attractive to Europe that still seems reluctant to rearm? Can Ukraine position itself not as a recipient of European security, but as a provider of it? And if so, what can Ukraine offer Europe that Europe cannot easily build on its own?
Yeah, let me start with that and then let John to that. I come from a family that very much was involved in the 1970s and 80s in terms of the development of military systems, et cetera, based off the Israeli experience in war, et cetera. And the opportunity, if you will, the development curve that Ukraine has is very similar to what Israel had in the 70s and 80s, where unfortunately one of the tragic offsets of war that becomes a benefit is the technology that you gain from actually actually using weapons on the battlefield, innovations that come about, transformations in military affairs, as John and his colleagues in the military world like to think of them. Ukraine is at the leading edge of that right now. And if you have a U.S. president that's calling for a $1.5 trillion defense budget, it's not just opportunities for Ukraine to sell that in Europe. There's massive opportunities for them to sell that in the U.S. if indeed Congress doesn't approve that $500 billion more in annual military spending. Much of that, given that warfare has changed on a dime here in Ukraine over the last 4 years, Ukraine's very much at the leading edge. You've proven your innovation capabilities are going out of the roof in terms of capabilities. And how to adapt, innovate, et cetera. And let me flip real quickly here to John on that one, because it's critical to understand you've taken basically, second-rate weapons systems, and you've turned them in many cases into first-rate systems. John?
No, like I said, Ukraine already is. They're already innovating, and they're innovating at the speed of war. Okay, they're not innovating on a 7-year procurement cycle that the West seems to get hung up in, testing and validating and what are our requirements. No, the requirements are real time. The requirements are today, and they are making changes and they are adapting on the move. Okay, so right now, Ukraine, if you want to look at it from a scientific mode, Ukraine's a big petri dish. And they are learning every day, and they are adapting every day, and they are adapting both to countermeasures that the Russians are putting in place and also measures in which to strike Russia. And they're also adapting on how they can defend against Russia. So it is real time, and it is something that NATO and the United States, and I use the two separately because sometimes they act separate, but that they could benefit from. Real time, they could benefit from that technology. And right now, I think they are trying to, but still, we're seeing the U.S. Army is doing something now called transition and contact, in which they're trying to bring in UAVs into the Army structure and incorporate them into offensive and defensive operations. But that is taking time, and some of the systems that they're using are already outdated because of what's going on in the battlefield in Ukraine. They can learn from Ukraine, and they should learn from Ukraine. They should be bringing them in right now.
Well, that was very nice to hear, because for me as a Ukrainian, I'm pretty sure we have a lot to offer to the world, but I don't know the perspective from the other side. That's...
Yeah, exactly, Natalie. Look, you sunk a navy without a navy of your own to speak of. That tells you the innovation is through the roof. Ukraine has a ton to offer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Mark, John, thank you so much for your precious time, for your insight, and welcome again on Channel 24 when you're going to be ready. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Natalie.
Hey, thanks for having us back. It's always a great opportunity.